Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Pisolans, and every Saturday, we look at some stories shaping our continent. First, Uganda is on edge as security forces clamp down on opposition protests, even as President Yoweri Museveni faces mounting discontent. We'll unpack the latest developments and potential implications for the region. Next, West African criminal networks are feeling the heat. Interpol's Operation Jackal 3 has dealt a significant blow to these syndicates involved in financial fraud, human trafficking, and more. We will examine the scale of the problem and the challenges it poses for the region. Finally, the fate of Nigeria's largest oil refinery hangs in the balance. Aliko Dangote, Africa's richest man, is considering handing over his multi-billion-dollar project to the Nigerian government. We'll discuss this move within the context of the country's economic sector. Joining me for in-depth analysis and expert insights on these critical stories is Confidence Makari, Senior Security Analyst at SBM Intelligence. Welcome, Confidence.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you. So, Confidence, on our first story, can you tell us what motivated Ugandans to organize this protest? Why are they planning it? And then who are the main organizers or backers of this protest?
All right, first things first. The thing you should know is that the protest is largely driven by sentiments against corruption. And many of the protesters believe that corruption in government circles, especially as regards to parliament, is above the roof, is through the rooftops, and they have come out to the streets. So they have come out onto the streets to protest. So unlike what's happening in Kenya, the protests are largely driven by the position in Uganda. So for according to Transparency International, corruption is a very big problem in Uganda. So it ranks very low, of about 2600 in the last corruption report or corruption survey the agency did. So it's globally ranks 141 over 180. So it's a big problem in the country, and yes, many people believe that it's time to take a stand, having been inspired by the Gen Z protesters in not so far away Kenya. So the things you should know is that it's mostly driven by frustrations with corruption in the public service, and it's been driven by the position led by the NUP under former singer turned politician Bobby Wine.
All right. So how has the long rule of the president contributed to this protest? And how has he been able to maintain his grip on power through these years, despite having opposition?
So in Uganda, there is no united opposition, or there wasn't any united opposition until about 2019, 2020, when Bobby Wine rose to the scene. So basically what we had was the Yoweri Museveni's NRM, for the National Resistance Movement, which metamorphosed from a guerrilla group into a political party. To entrench itself in power since 1986, Museveni came into office as a guerrilla fighter, as a revolutionary, having fought both the Milton Obote government and the Idi Amin government, which fell at the end of the war with Tanzania in the 1980s. So Museveni came into office promising, lampooning African heads of states for sitting tight in office and refusing to give way and suppressing the opposition. But when he came into office, he did the exact opposite of what he preached when he was a revolutionary. So part of what he has been able to maintain his power is through the vast patronage networks that run across the state. Apart from that, putting his family members in sensitive positions has also enabled the strengthening of his rule. So his son, popularly known as Mahuzi, is a major general in the army who I think very recently retired, whom some people tout as the person to take over from him. So apart from the patronage network and his family, Museveni has been able to maintain grip on power by using state forces to repress civil spaces and to crack down on dissent. So one of the biggest hallmarks of this was the 2020 protests, the 2020 election crisis, which opposition protesters protested and got a heavy crackdown so bad that the international community, especially the United States, which provide key economic and security assistance to the government, the Museveni government had to issue condemnations and attempts to try to step back or scale back the amount of economic aid they give to Uganda. So through the use of patronage networks, through the use of state-sponsored repression and crackdowns, such as what they've been trying to do with these protests ever since it was announced, Museveni has been able to entrench and stay in office since 1986, rather.
Okay, and it's obvious that he's still doing that now, considering the closing down of the opposition headquarters this week.
Yes.
So what's the
Yeah.
current state of play? Yes, I'm just going to question that. Like, what's the current state of play now? How are people responding to that? Because I know it threatened the protesters and said they are playing with fire. So what has been the reaction of the citizens? How have they reacted to that?
It hasn't stopped people from protesting, at least not online. The one of the things about Uganda's protest that you should know is that it is largely driven by young people. The government really shut down social media or shut down the internet. So even if there has been a lot of repression by state forces, especially with the police, against protesters, no matter how few they have been, given how much they place themselves. I'm talking about the police now, given how much they place themselves in strategic areas across the streets to look for any sign of protester. It doesn't stop people from drumming up support for the protest online. So the question now remains how much really can happen, or how much change can be brought to bear through online protest and the likes. So one of the hallmarks of state-sponsored repression is how quickly they arrest the opposition figures. So far, unlike in 2020, Bobby Wine has not really been detained. But if this protest persists, if people still persist and take to the streets, I do think that it will go it will go beyond just the shutting down of the opposition party's headquarters, and I think it will go far into the arrest of key political figures in the opposition, especially Bobby Wine.
Okay, so do you think, are there any parallels between the protests in Uganda and then those in uh, Kenya, and then, of course, the planned protests in Nigeria? Can we draw any parallel lines between these three countries?
So there are a few, and one of the similarities is that the protesters in Kenya were driven are largely young people, generation Gen Z protesters, as they like to call themselves. In Kenya, the protest started in response to the government's planned finance bill, which people believe that it was too much of a burden on them, and it was basically passing the buck of the government's austerity measures onto people instead of the government getting a haircut by trying to be fiscally responsible. In Kenya, it is largely driven by uh, perceptions of corruption, which the protesters believe is through the roof and needs to be met with government gusto. And in Nigeria, it's the planned protest is driven by economic challenges together. So I think in terms of causes, what the two protests that look quite alike in terms of causes will be Kenya and Nigeria, but the substance largely differ. But one thing you could draw as parallel in terms of similarity is who drives this protest. Nigeria, for instance, has had this history of protests being led by people by having leaders, people who have spent years in perhaps in politics or in the civil society or in opposition parties and everything. But since 2020, many Nigerian protesters have sought to simply have a leaderless movement from which they believe that it will be difficult for the government to control these protests. But I think that's largely where the similarities end. Some people believe that Africa is a country, given the challenges that we have across the continent, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. But one key difference between all of the three is that in Uganda, the protests have been led by an arrowhead, which is the head of the recognizable opposition party.
Okay. So Confidence, there's something I wanted to comment on, which is a recent Afrobarometer report that showed that only 44% of Nigerians would reject a military takeover if there's abuse of power. And then 53% of Africans would accept a military takeover if leaders abuse power. So as it is, it seems like the perspective of Africans is shifting with regard to military rule. So do you think that going back to military rule is what we need right now? Is it going to solve all of our problems? The countries that have transitioned to military rule in recent times, how are they faring? What do you think?
So I wouldn't agree with the idea that returning to military rule will solve our problems, but I do understand the attraction to military rule. So Africa has a median age of about 18.1. So I mean, it just definitely shows you that how young the population is. So you have more people, for instance, in Nigeria that are between the ages of 0 and 14 years in Nigeria than you have about old people above the age of 65. So the people in Nigeria that are 65 and above are just only about 2%. So Nigeria's life expectancy hovers between 48 and about 53. So it's a country of young people. Why this demographic statistic matters a lot is that many people do not are quite young or very young, and so do not remember the horrors of military rule. So most of their lives, they live under what could be described as civilian rule, but not necessarily democracy. It could be democratic in name, but in substance, it isn't. So they haven't really seen the horrors of military rule. They didn't live through the years of revolutionary wars that led to independence, and so they do not really have that kind of a fondness for the older generation of rulers that the older generation of people who existed at the time of independence or these revolutionary wars had. So the more this older generation dies off, the younger generation comes up, the more we are going to be seeing demands of good governance. So you're going to be having demands such as put up or get out. So the get out now means that if you leave and the military takes over, it will be bad because since you've been here, we haven't really seen any difference. So it's better for the military to step in to clear your mess. But from what we've seen, I mean, as at the time of recording this, it's the 1 year anniversary of the Niger coup that ousted President Mohamed Bazoum from office. One of the reasons why the military junta ousted him was because of what they felt as poor performance in terms of security, managing the country's security crisis. But the fact remains that ever since then, the problem has not really improved. As a matter of fact, statistically, Niger now experience more attacks from armed groups across the western parts of the country and the southern parts than they used to experience when Bazoum was in office. So it's almost largely the same story in countries like Burkina Faso and Mali that kicked their democratically elected governments away from office and replaced them with the military. So the one thing about the allure to a military rule is that it quickly dries off. The honeymoon period is very short, and for a region like the Sahel where there are numerous economic and security problems, I do not think that the honeymoon period lasts even up to 3 months nowadays. So it's usually fire. So uh, in summary, I understand why people, especially young people, crave military rule, but I do not really think it's a good idea.
Okay, so moving on to our next story, which is about Operation Jackal 3, targeting West African crime groups. So, Confidence, can you provide an overview of this operation? What were the objectives? What were the key outcomes of this operation?
All right. So the International Police or Interpol launched this operation targeting um, that spanned 3 months from about April to July, where having been concerned about the illegal financial illegal financial flows, especially as regards to online fraud, financial fraud that is stemming from Africa. In response, so they launched this operation to stem the tide, and then their particular focus was zeroed in on the Black Axe movement, which is for many Nigerians that live in Nigeria, they'll be familiar with the name. Black Axe is started as a campus-based youth gang that quickly turned violent. And while it turned violent, it spread across many of Nigeria's campuses, especially in the Middle Belt and the South, and has many members that span both Nigeria, West Africa, Africa, and across continents in the world. Because some of their members moved countries and settled in different parts of the world, which, by virtue of annual dues and remittances to the members, the organization, they are by far the biggest and the richest of the cult groups, like we like to call them in Nigeria, in terms of financial pool. But part of what makes them strong is their involvement in online fraud. What is popularly known as Yahoo or romance scams in Nigeria, targeting people in other countries. But so far, the from I think from what we could read from Operation Jackal, it wasn't targeting only non-Africans in the Western countries. It's nowadays it also targets Africans in Nigeria and other parts of West African countries. According to what Interpol said, is that they've recovered about $3 million and closed down about 720 accounts so far in the course of the investigation.
Yeah, so confidence. I like that you mentioned Black Axe because I was thinking, isn't this an indictment, of the ability of our law enforcement and security agents, a a very typical example to show that they're really struggling to do their jobs? Or why do you think that group was able to rise so fast, despite the fact that we have this security agent and this law enforcement?
All right, I'm going to start by giving credit to Interpol, and I know that it wouldn't really have been possible without the participation of the Nigerian police, which is also a member of Interpol. So the problem now becomes, if Interpol hasn't taken up the gauntlet to investigate these crimes, would the Nigerian police have taken the initiative? The answer to that question is no. And one of the reasons is because Black Axe as an organization does not exist in isolation. As repulsive as they are to their rivals, such as King's Confraternity or AA or Maffites or Buccaneers or several other ones that they are often in clash with, they are big and they have members across different strata of Nigerian society. They have members in government, they have members in the private sector, they have members in banks, they have members not just in Nigeria but across the world. So it's a lot difficult for you to take down such an organization that have extensive links even with the security services in Nigeria. There is this running joke that the name of the River State House of Assembly is Vikings House. Given how many of members of the House of Assembly that have ties with the Supreme Vikings Confraternity. And so it's not just Vikings alone that some of them belong to. They belong to different ones that are domiciled out of Port Harcourt that sometimes stretch even to Bayelsa, such as Debam and Dewell. Nowadays, many of them go by Iceland and Greenlanders and are affiliated to different major political parties in the states. So it gives you a fair idea how the problem of youth gang seep far deeper into the Nigerian state. So for you to take down an organization like Black Axe, you really have to close ranks and run a very, very subtle campaign that is going to take prominent members of society down. And it's a work that the Nigerian police is first of all not equipped for and do not have the political will to carry out.
Okay, so why are so many youths turning to cybercrime? Are there socioeconomic factors like maybe unemployment, poverty, high cost of living causing this, or it's just purely due to low cybersecurity in Africa?
Yeah. So there is a part of there are some analysts who believe that it's easier for people to get into cybercrime when there is poverty and the likes. So, but one of the reasons why I don't really buy into that argument is that Nigeria is not the poorest country in the world. We've had countries with even lower purchasing power and lower GDP than we do, or even worse life expectancy than Nigeria have, but do not feature in ranks of do not make an appearance in the top ranks of financial fraud, especially online fraud in the world, with the kind of sophistication that Nigerian fraudsters have. And I also do not really buy that argument because in terms of skills and sophistication, Nigeria does not record as much financial fraudsters in volume and in terms of population as much as countries in the West and in Asia, such as India and even the United States and Russia has. So I don't really think it's a thing of poverty. Yes, poverty might be a reason why somebody might go into fraud, but I do think what really leads people to what really makes this financial fraud a thing is the poor cybersecurity awareness that we have in this part of the world. And apart from that, the financial institutions do not take cybersecurity seriously. I recall the story that was leaked to the Nigerian that made the story that made Nigerian media rounds at the beginning of between the beginning of last year to middle of last year, where a a hacker on LinkedIn wrote about his experience in the dark web, where the API of a certain Nigerian bank name withheld was leaked, and then people on the dark web were buying Nigerian's private data that was leaked from that particular bank for as low as 200 naira. Just about a month ago, some news organizations, I think the Foundation for Investigative Journalism, published a report where it showed that hackers were getting information of Nigerians from NIN and they were buying the NIN data, that's the National Identification Number data of the Minister of Communications and ICT, that's Dr. Boson Tijani, for about 100 naira on the dark web. So the point I'm making is this. On one hand, you have a financial institution that holds the data of hundreds of thousands of Nigerians, not taking cybersecurity seriously. And then you have the government that's supposed to be holding these people accountable, also not taking cybersecurity seriously. So the question now becomes, who will guard the guardians? So the government is not doing its job in terms of regulation, and then the extant laws that permit these people or mandate these organizations to report data breach, first of all, to the persons affected and then to the governments, do not get respected. So there is only so much that we can do in terms of regulation and law enforcement in this country to stop this menace. So, because I do believe that as far as these problems exist, especially from the government side of regulation, and as far as these problems exist, people in Black Acts movement, people even far away from Black Acts movement, as far back as Israel, Russia, and India are going to take advantage of the situation and going to exploit any perceived weakness or weaknesses.
All right, so before we move to our last story, I was wondering how important is regional collaboration among West African countries? How important is that in combating organized crime? How can international
Yeah, it is.
cooperation help strengthen regulations against them?
Yeah, it is very, very important. But one of the ways in which to make such kind of collaboration work is to actively go beyond the rhetoric of transnational collaboration and actually do the work. As my background as a security analyst gives me insight to how poorly manned the borders in Africa are. So there's a notion that Africa's borders do not exist; they exist only on paper. And given the poor security across the border, we've had commitments and proclamations of the problem without requisite solutions to accompany it. So I do think that if there is an interest in combating or collaborating to combat these transnational crimes. So far, historically, and from what we've seen, it's not going to go beyond rhetoric into real action, because many of them do not, first of all, do not, many heads of states do not really acknowledge the problem. And it takes organizations like the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime, as well as the United Nations Office on Counterterrorism, working with regional organizations like the African Union to shed light on the problem. Even at that, states do not really take the problem seriously. So they first of all have to acknowledge that at the very top, they first of all have to acknowledge that there is indeed a problem, and task whoever is in charge or whatever agencies are in charge to look into the problem and take care of it. Where there is a will, there is a way. But first of all, they have to acknowledge the problem and find the political will to carry it out, or to carry the solutions out, rather.
Okay, so moving on to our last story, which is about the Dangote refinery. So we heard that Aliko Dangote is willing to relinquish his oil refinery to the NNPC. So confidence, why is Dangote considering this? I mean, we all thought that this was going to be what we needed, to at least help Nigeria with its oil problems, but apparently it's becoming the opposite.
All right, so the spark between Dangote and the NNPC, as well as the Nigerian Midstream Downstream Regulatory Authority, has been on the national media for a couple of days, and it appears that the NNPC and the NMDPRA uh, are not willing to give Dangote all the support he needs to make his refinery operational. To start with, the NNPC refused to make payments by way of cash or crude oil supply. And crude oil supply required to take up the option of 20% equity stake in the refinery. What I think pushed Dangote over the edge was the statement that was made by the NMDPRA CEO to the press that they cannot rely heavily on one refinery to supply petroleum products. So they sorry about that. That they cannot rely on only one refinery to supply petroleum products to the country because of the risks to energy security. And I think he also added that in terms of quality, that the product is a lot much inferior to the imported quality, which in a way was trying to imply that they do not really have faith in Dangote, especially in domestic capacity, that giving left to them, they will prefer to import the crude that they will refine or to sell it to the country. So Dangote took it as a disinterest, at least from the state organizations in his refinery, and having spent so much money for about if I'm not mistaken, of about $20 billion at the very least in setting up the refinery, he believes that the time has come for him to pull out and then give the stake to the NNPC. But the problem now is the NNPC is not really in a position to buy that stake. So there seems to be like a friction between them. So the Dangote from his own position is willing to sell the refinery, but there doesn't seem to be a willing buyer in the NNPC. And apart from that, one of the key issues here is that the man has not been able to get the business up and running because he has not been able to find crude, not from Nigeria and not abroad. And one of the reasons why he has not been able to find crude in Nigeria, despite the fact that Nigeria produces crude, is the fact that many of the available crude, as well as the future ones, have been pledged to other countries as part of loan agreements, and as part of loan agreements for other countries or other lenders to give some amount of Nigeria to stabilize forex. And internationally, you also could not get crude because there is this, should I say, mental blacklist of Nigeria in terms of lenders that Nigerians do not really come through, and other people have also pledged their production to other customers or investors, and they do not really have that much to spare to him.
All right. So one of the things that Dangote said was that, especially when he was talking about the steel sector, he said he was not going to invest in the steel sector anymore to avoid being labeled a monopolist. And recently we heard that Gabon government is trying to woo him, to come invest in their country. So do you think that this move by the federal government is more of maybe has angered someone in government, and then they're just trying to shut down this as a personal vendetta or something? And do you think that this is going to discourage investment and discourage business owners and people who want to actually do something or invest in the country?
So to begin with, there's this tradition of Dangote meeting with whoever the president of Nigeria is, and many people believe that that is how he was able to run his empires, business empire as a monopolist. But I do think that, if I'm not mistaken, ever since Tinubu became president about a year ago, we haven't seen a picture of him and Dangote together. So there's first speculations that the president might be behind these ordeals. So the president hasn't really warmed up to the idea of Dangote, and many people believe that this is one of the reasons why he's struggling without that necessary federal government support. And as for the government of Gabon trying to woo him, he depends on what they are wooing him for. If it is for petroleum, I do think that there's nothing much that the Nigerian state loses, because it's just simply going to carry on with business as usual. But I think on the short term, the Nigerian state wouldn't really feel it. But what the refinery was supposed to solve basically was the problem of spending forex outside to refine products and then bring it back to Nigeria, which was taking a toll on what the government was paying on subsidies. But the government has shown so far that it doesn't have any interest in stopping subsidy payments anytime soon, and they're going to pay subsidies until they no longer can. But we don't know when that time would be. I don't think, but given our estimations, it's not so far off. But they don't care. So Dangote, business-wise, in terms of his general business operations, I don't think he's going to pull the plug on Nigeria. But I do think that in terms of the refinery, he might look at, or in terms of the oil industry and the sector, he might want to cut his losses soon and go over to Gabon. So I do think that where it will hurt Nigeria the most, if he moves his entire business away from the country to another country. There's a post that is being circulated by a fellow billionaire, Femi Otedola, which is allegedly written by the president of the Africa Development Bank, Akin Additional, which seemed to be in support of Dangote, saying that accusations of him running a monopoly are far-fetched, because it is impossible for you to run a successful venture as a local operator if the government does not ban imports. It's going to make you lose your investment. So among the elite class, among the billionaire class, especially for people that are sympathetic to Dangote, they sort of understand him. They haven't really come out to back him like that, but I think the a few feet are beginning to move. But then, since the Nigerian House of Representatives and the National Assembly has decided to wade into the dispute between Dangote and the NNPC, yeah, I do think that for the short to medium term, the threat of him moving his entire business operations away from Nigeria is stalled.
All right. Thank you so much, Confidence, for joining us and participating in today's episode.
Thank you for having me once again. Do take care.
Yeah, and to all our listeners, this podcast is by SBM Intelligence. For deeper insight into our work, please visit our website at sbmintel.com. And remember to connect with us on social media. You can find us on X, Facebook, and LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. That will be all for today. Thanks for listening. See you next week. Cheers.